So we have more great stuff for you. Our next panel is driving inclusive design as the new gold standard. So despite being designed for large patient populations, MedTech solutions often overlook the needs of specific individuals due to various factors such as poverty, homelessness, lack of education, advanced age, immobility, rural location, limited English proficiency, or belonging to different ethnic or racial groups. Fortunately, the medtech industry has the tools and resources to create flexible solutions that address these needs from the outset. This entails developing AI-guided diagnostics, digital platforms, wearables, and other non-traditional healthcare technologies. To achieve inclusive design, MedTech must make it a top priority. Fortunately, innovators and designers in the MedTech community are leading the way by developing new policies, protocols, and solutions. We have some amazing trailblazers here who are transforming MedTech design and innovation. And on a special note, when we were brainstorming the composition of this panel, one of our organizing team raised her hand to curate and moderate this panel, and she's actually got her PhD in the space. It's in her DNA. So we are in really good hands here. Moderating this panel will be our very own Kate Stevenson, founder and principal of Dyad Engineering.
True story about why I'm sitting in this chair today. And I was originally tasked with developing and putting together this amazing panel. And as I started putting the panel together, I started to get kind of excited because what I am at heart is an innovation researcher. And I basically got started in that because about 12 years ago, I actually had a lot of the same questions that I think Havisa brought up earlier about pediatric devices. And I started thinking about how do we get ideas and how do we get products in the end market and what happens in between. And if I can get my slide up, is basically I realized I'm an engineer. I worked at a design firm for many years, worked for catheters, never got to work on a single pediatric problem. And I started wondering why. And I realized a lot of the whys were not in my current scope. I was in the invention and building stage. Hopefully, are there a few other engineers in the room? Hopefully a few, okay. Most of you in this room, though, you know about all this other stuff that I did not even know existed a decade ago. And so when they started asking me about designing for equity, how do you deal with health equity as you're developing new technologies? Well, I think you do it the same way as you develop any good practice in medical device, whether you're designing for manufacturing, whether you're designing for your operations, whether you're designing for cost benefits, you have to do it from the very beginning. And I said, dang it, for this panel, I'm going to need scientists, I'm going to need doctors, I'm going to need lawyers, I'm going to need entrepreneurs. And somehow I was actually about to pull it off with this amazing group of women. I have not shared a stage with this much high-powered in this many different fields as once. It's a reason why I have the biggest panel today. So if I pull out my Coach Katie voice and have to cut them off and move them on, it's because we are progressing the entire medical device pipeline today back and forth to basically go, where are the opportunities, where are the challenges, so that we don't just get to the end and say, okay, can we fix health equity with this product we've already got on the market? But start from the very beginning. And so I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves today, starting with Dr. Rashid.
Thank you, Katie. So I'm Lita Rashid. I'm a physician actually here in the Bay Area. I work with one of our county health systems out in the East Bay. And I am also a physician at the Digital Health Center of Excellence at the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I've been in practice for about 10 years, and the majority of my practice has always been within a county health system because I, probably like many of you here today, have a deep passion for health equity and for serving marginalized, historically underrepresented communities, of which I am from. I'm originally from Afghanistan. So that is me in a nutshell, and I'm very excited to be on this panel today. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm equally honored to be on this panel, especially with that introduction. I'm Catherine Zavala. I'm the COO of MedTech Innovator and Managing Director of BioTools Innovator. If you don't know MedTech Innovator, there's quite a number of women here from our organization, including CL, who is our 2022 Grand Prize winner. We're the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world. To date, we've supported 509, actually 600 if you count this year's cohort companies. And they've achieved almost 40 exits, brought about $8 billion in follow-on, or $7 billion in follow-on equity funding. So very successful group, and again, some incredible women here that actually represent a lot of the cohort companies we have.
Truly honored to be part of this really amazing, talented panel. My name is Nivi Arumugam. I'm an R&D and product leader that's shipped medical devices and healthcare software, including data products. I've worked at Becton Dickinson as the VP of R&D for connected care products in their largest business. And prior to that, I worked at Google Life Sciences Verily and led sensor development and also emerging medical device technology. And prior to that, I worked in the consumer space. I think a lot of the health to clinical outcomes spectrum, I'm lucky to have been working on sensors that came from the consumer space. So I think that's the diversity I bring to this panel. So excited to be having this conversation.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. This conference is always a must-do on my calendar because this group of women walks the walk, right? I'm Vanessa Pollard. I lead the food and drug law practice at the global law firm of McDermott, Will & Emery. I also co-chair our global life sciences practice. My passion is that I'm a board member, founding member of MedTech Color, which is a nonprofit with a singular mission of diversifying medtech. And we are grateful that MedTech Women has been a supporter from the very beginning. We have 3 key areas that we focus on in MedTech Color. One is creating a community and a network for diverse professionals in medtech, with our networking breakfast being our singular event in that space. Our second is our pitch competition. Our keynote speaker today, Havisa Mohammed, was the first prize winner of the 2002 MedTech Color pitch competition. And our third area is really driving thought leadership on issues that impact communities of color, and we do that through the MedTech Color Collaborative community on addressing health equity and medical device development and clinical trials, which we do in conjunction with FDA. So I'm excited to be here and excited to be among this great panel.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. Hi, everyone. My name is CL Tan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of FIX Technologies. We have the distinct honor and privilege to work with the best in medtech to replace the use of ethylene oxide for the sterilization and shipment of over 50% of medical devices. If you're not familiar, ETO is being severely regulated and litigated against because it's been connected with cancer in almost 100 communities across the U.S. So, we get to work day in and day out actually implementing a technology which allows companies to sterilize safely where and when they make medical devices. Not only are our customers just so forward-thinking, but on the back end, we also get to reduce the use of something that's harmful in our footprint as an industry, right? Create better outcomes for our neighbors, and in the meanwhile, increase the net margins for products and bring products faster to market. So we're in the midst of systemic change within these organizations in a very tough area to innovate, supply chain. So super excited to share some stories, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just grateful all of you actually got here today, and we were able to go from, going all the way from the clinical bedside all the way down to the supply chain. And so one of the things I asked all the panelists today was to think on their own area of practice. And one of my goals I had of this panel was that each of them could be able to share a part of their story, a part of their profession, so that everyone in this room could take away some ideas about how health equity is something that every one of us have opportunities in our work, in our practice, like everything from the engineers to, they're all practices that we're developing at this time to contribute. And so Dr. Rashid, you have some stories for us?
Oh, I've got plenty of stories.
That you can tell us
I will,
without.
yeah, right.
Okay.
I will tell maybe one or two. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is such a great way to start this panel, by the way. So I want to give some examples of missed and delayed diagnosis, because this is what I happen to see quite a bit serving a largely lower socioeconomic status patient population. So I had a patient semi-early in my career who came into a hospital that I happened to be at, and she presented with pretty late-stage breast cancer. Now, when I sort of went back to think about why this was the case, she was a young Hispanic woman in her 40s, kids working, how did this kind of happen? And I go back and I look, and this was in the Bay Area, and I see a lot of different care touch points throughout the Bay Area that had been created for her, right? Excuse me. So she's at one health system for one chief complaint. She might be at another health system for another chief complaint. And what I've come to sort of appreciate, and I think this is sort of part of my own origin story of how I ended up in digital health, is that we often don't think of data as an equity variable, and that in practice, what I have seen is that we often see patients like her who don't have, for example, a medical home. And so what they do is they create data in a lot of disparate places, right? And what I think is a real opportunity in medtech, particularly as we see the emerging use of technologies such as sensors and wearables and home-based devices, is I think we have an opportunity to collect that kind of data about patients like her and be able to intervene earlier, screen earlier. She certainly met all of the screening criteria for screening a woman below age 40 for breast cancer. And so that's part of where my hope is, that we advance these technologies to really meet people where they are, because not everybody can have sort of that traditional medical home. So that's my story. But there's plenty like it, I think. Yeah.
I'll take things in a different direction. So where I sit with MedTech Innovator, I'm working with a lot of the innovators who are coming up with these solutions. And I guess thinking back to when I started at this company, at this organization, it was always a value of ours to have equal representation of women and men. And when Jessica talked earlier about manels, I mean, we were always very conscious about people we were putting up on stage, especially the makeup of our cohort. And we would always, take a moment to say, hey, do we have enough representation here? And I would say, maybe it's some of the efforts done in this room and all of you individually. I've seen a lot of advancement over the last 8 years that I've been part of this organization. And one specific example is last year when CL won our competition. On stage, we had 4 female judges, and 4 of the 5 finalists were female. And none of that was on purpose. Like, that's just how the industry was. We just saw a lot of great women who deserved to be there. I would say, though, that we haven't been as good on the other side of that, looking at people of color. And so I had an opportunity over the last few years to really think about and dive into how we can improve that pipeline at MedTech Innovator. And one of the partnerships I'm really proud of is working with Vanessa and the group at MedTech Color, where 10 of their companies each year get in through the first round of our selection process. I do think we have a lot more work to do there. I'd love to see a lot more representation, not just in our cohort, but also on the judging side.
Awesome. So my story is more like my origin story, how I got to know about health equity. I got my first Kindle, I think 2011, and the first book I read was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And I didn't know much about health equity or even representation in clinical trials, and that book was a true eye-opener. I moved into the medical device space, healthcare space in 2015, 2016 time zone. And I thought about health equity as an engineer, as a product leader, I'm building this device, so I should think about representation and testing and make sure that we are inclusive from that perspective. And you all, this is a cliched example, you all know about the pulse oximetry, health disparity. So I worked on health sensors, physiological sensing with PPGs, with photoplethysmography, and measuring heart rate, and it became very clear I'm a woman of color, and testing on myself and like just testing on 10 people that were part of our cohort, it became pretty clear that we should not be thinking about inclusive design after the product's like conceived of, or even like after a picture has been drawn. We should think about inclusive design way before. And that's really the health equity piece. We were talking about how we do design for manufacturing and design for usability way ahead. So similarly, I was lucky to be part of Google at that time, and we created this committee of inclusive design across all of Google, and Google's always been designing for everybody. And since it jumped into healthcare, it was a really good launch pad for us to be able to have that coalition and define what sensor health equity meant. And we were able to write down some very simple, and there's some examples of success. Previously, we used to use this scale called Fitzpatrick scale, which was a 5 tones, and there was 1 tone or 2 tones representing the darker shades and 3 to 4 tones representing the lighter shades. And now in the last year, there's been this new Monk scale by Dr. Ellis Monk. It was driven by his work. It's a 10-tone scale where there's 5 to 6 tones that represent darker shades, which is truly the inclusive nature of how we should be thinking about design. So I'm super psyched that we're spending a whole day talking about health equity. So I've matured over the years to think about health equity as the fundamental everything, right? Like it's just like usability and just like manufacturability. It's a key pillar. So that's my origin story, and I'm excited that there's so many of you here talking about this today.
I'm always blown away as like the lone lawyer among all of these wonderful clinicians and scientists. And sometimes it sounds a little bit like Charlie Brown's teacher to me, but I'm sort of naturally curious, right? And I always bring things back to I'm a patient. At the end of the day, we all are, we all have been. So my origin story is that I started my career in a big law firm, went to FDA, and it was the making of me as a lawyer. And while I was at FDA, all lawyers, or many, sort of passed through the enforcement phase, where the question would always be, when we're making a decision to shut down a company or send a warning letter or bring an action, what if it was you? What if it was your child? What if it was your family member? What would you do? And that has always been sort of a guiding principle and a North Star for me. In my life, I represent companies with big FDA problems, and sometimes the legal answers are very easy to the early stage tech CEO who calls me at 6 a.m., says, I've got a problem, and I say, what's the problem? And he says, FDA's outside. And I say, where are you? And he's like, I'm in the bathroom. Easy answer. Get off the phone with me, go open the door, and then we'll take it from there. But the more sort of exciting problems are the opportunity to just talk to, a lot of times, inventor founders, big strategic companies, and people who have big ideas. So about, I would say 10 years ago, I picked up the phone from a founder who had a technology that was going to allow general practitioners or family practitioners to sort of take a picture of suspicious lesions and run it through an assessment that would give them some ideas of what it could be. You know, could be melanoma, could be eczema. And he was very excited about the data set that this software had been trained on. I asked about the data set. It was primarily white women from Europe. And so going back to that North Star as a patient, I said, is this something that would work on me or on darker skin tones? And he said, you know, I actually hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, if you're looking to launch this product in the US market, you're gonna have to think about it and consider it. And his response was, well, thinking as a business person, could I expedite the process by simply having an indication that's clear that it is only for lighter skin tones and that the outcomes can't be, generalized to broader or more melanated populations. And so as the regulatory lawyer in me and the advocate, I take a step back and I say, okay, so there is potentially a pathway where you do all of that disclosure and essentially your product is safe and effective for only white women. And we talked about all the reasons why that wouldn't be a good strategy. But going back to the patient in me, right, and as somebody, like many Black women who grew up for most of my life thinking that melanated skin is somehow immune, right, from the effects of the sun, who spent hours in the sun, who never wore sunscreen, until I actually got sunburned, which I didn't even think was possible, and then had to go to the doctor with a mole. And then I went back to this conversation, is the technology, is the knowledge base out there so that they can even assess what a potential melanoma looks like in melanated, with more skin that's more melanated or Black skin. And that interaction, my journey as a patient, that's always been my North Star. And so when Netta Hanafi, who's my sister, we get into a lot of good trouble together, and who is, a legend in MedTech Women, a co-founder of MedTech Color, came to me and said, I have this thing, we're gonna do a collaborative community with FDA, and we are gonna focus on solving these issues. That was sort of the catalyst, and that's why I do the work that I do.
So we're in the business of making medical devices, right? How the sausage is made. And when we first started the company, everyone thought we were crazy. No one messes with supply chain. The innovations on the product side don't fix what's not broken. But one thing that we knew to be true at the beginning was we can't be in the business of health for all when health for all means we've narrowed the circle to exclude others. And so when we think about health equity, you think sterilization, that's not related. But we have such an honor and privilege to impact things in the short term, medium term, and the long term. And what I mean by that is, I think of one of our customers, when they started regulating ethylene oxide, the first plants shut down in 2019. They had no products. They have a protective product. It helps surgeons, keeps them safe. They had no product on the market for 6 months because they couldn't find an alternative. If that happens again, that product's getting shelved, right? And so the bar is really high. But the way that we see it is we're here to help them win at what they need to win at, which is keep the product continuity, getting new products to patients faster, the amount of delays associated with sterilization before there are backups. Anyone in product development knows it's not fast. And now with the backups, with the shutdowns, with the regulations, it's even worse. So when you think about novel technologies that are trying to get to the clinic, trying to, after they're cleared, getting to the hospitals, anytime if we can cut down a total of a year, that means better outcomes. But it's a system change. Right? In the medium term, if we can reduce the use of a known cancer-causing gas that's been linked to gnarly cancers, right? Usually in communities of color, that's great. That's a win. And in the long term, by bringing something in-house, these are companies that are saying, we've never had to change supply chain in this way, but we're down for it because it makes our lives easier. Oh, by the way, for every product you move in-house, here's how many metric tons of CO2 we are no longer emitting on an annual basis. And once you add that up, it's extraordinary. But we don't do that coming to our customers and say, oh, we're here to create equitable outcomes. And that's something that we've learned is we're here and we work with people all the way from, your engineers all the way up to C-suite. Everyone has their own incentives. We want to help you win at your job. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can drive equitable outcomes, and my team has the privilege of doing that every day in and day out. But it started and it continues to be with how do we make sure that you as the manufacturing manager have a smooth line? How do we make sure you as a CFO don't lose sleep overnight because your working capital is tied up in a bunch of product somewhere in the ether that you can't get out, and that you're a rep and you don't know when you can tell your surgeon when you're going to get product to have this life-saving surgery, right? So I think, certainly we can focus on the products that make an impact, but there are amazing women and men doing the work every day, and we get to see this firsthand, to change things for the better, and the impact will be seen within months and years, but it also will be seen in decades, and that's extremely exciting.
Thank you for the. So CL just gave me a very soft pitch back to my next question, which is talking about aligning incentives, and then realizing that at every point in this line, all of us, we have different jobs. I mean, ultimately, the ultimate job is we want to heal patients. We want to keep people healthy. We want to make everyone healthy. But on our day-to-day jobs, sometimes we have practices, we have standards, we have things that we've been trained to do over generations. And even medical device, we have practices that are 60, 70, 80 years old that only recently we're starting to realize the data's appearing that they're actually contributing to equity issues. And so we started talking about some of the tensions between kind of the standard practices we have in our jobs and the translation or movement of things to address health equity. I'm an engineer by training. We always tell each other, don't reinvent the wheel. We see the young engineers and we pat them on the head and said, that's a nice idea. We're going to do it the way everyone else has done it for the last 20 years, except for the one thing that's covered in our patent. And that's because the FDA won't ask questions and we know it works. Well, we know it sort of works, or at least we know that there's no data out there showing that there's a problem with it. And so right now, some of the things we're facing with is, okay, here's these practices, standards, materials, processes that we think are effective and safe for as much as we know. But then there are all these new potential issues that they're contributing to health equity. And so as an engineer, and I'm going okay, which of these levers do I pull? Where do I push forward? And how do we incentivize switching from one to the other? So in each of your areas of practice, can you tell about when you're thinking about, I want to do this, but I'm also thinking about this, and by the way, I have to remember that as we're dealing with health equity?
What a great question, right? Because I think that struggle will always be there. And certainly in clinical medicine, I'll give an example from my practice, probably less so than my work at FDA, but many of you may be aware that, in medicine we use a lot of formulas and calculators and coefficients when we're trying to assess medications and laboratory evaluations, et cetera. And one of the things that has come up recently is this concept of a chronic kidney disease in Black patients, right? But many of you are familiar. We apply a race coefficient to a lab value called the glomerular filtration rate, which is essentially an indication of kidney function. And what the research now, this is very recent research, is showing is that coefficient that we've been applying over years now in clinical practice, that is a coefficient for race, for Black, for being Black, actually overestimates the function of the kidney. And what happens is now we are finding that, we have been delaying how soon we send Black patients to dialysis. We've been delaying how soon we send Black patients to transplant teams and starting medication, right? What a shock, right? As a clinician, I'm coming into this and going, wait, what did I learn in medical school? How is this a thing? And one of the concepts that has come out, I think, in health equity that is so fundamentally important if we're going to talk about health equity very deeply is that race is not necessarily a proxy of genetic ancestry, right? And so when we think about race, I would love, especially a group like this, to really think about what does race mean in this context of use for this patient population. Because there are certainly, I think, spaces where it is valuable and it is important, and we talk about race a lot when it comes to health equity. But then, as in this example that I gave, there are certainly times where race is not appropriate, and maybe we do use something else. And that's why the science, equity science, has to, in some ways, do better. We're still way too much at sort of the 10,000-foot level. So yeah, I would love for us to just think a lot more nuanced about race, socioeconomic status, all of these. I think, traditionally the principles of equity are things like socioeconomic status and health literacy and gender and disability and but what does that actually really mean? Is the disability of one group the same as the disability of another? And really, to me, this means, at least for this group who are essentially med technology innovators, not only thinking about it through the product life cycle, but perhaps even in the deployment stage. So what do we do once products leave our doors? And I know at FDA, we are thinking a lot about this in terms of what happens once things go into the real world. So, yeah.
So I remember, I just wanted to share, you're talking about, how long does it take to change clinical practice? We talk about, okay, it takes 3 to 5 years to get to market. Oh, no, it takes 10 years to get reimbursement. And, how long does it take to change standard practice as taught in every medical school in the country?
I wish I had a number for you. I wish I had a number for you, but
Longer.
We need to do better, certainly.
I guess when you talk about aligning incentives, I can kind of speak from the innovators that I've worked with, and they're often really small companies raising these rounds, especially in a funding environment as it is right now. And so, asking them to kind of rethink their clinical trial design and develop these plans that include big populations when they're already trying to, spend, be capital efficient with the funds that they have is a big challenge. But I do think that there are ways that, that the policy, even FDA, things like that, can help these companies to achieve that. One of the things, that came up in the last few years was around breakthrough device designation and opening up the types of companies to get that, other companies that are working on accessibility, because when you talk about devices that are more effective, which is one of the criteria for that designation, if you can make an argument that accessibility makes it more effective across the population. And I would say another example of companies that, and we'll talk about this later, I guess, on the next panel, is that there is a lot of market opportunity when you start to open up the types of patients that are going to be affected by your medical product. And some examples, our very first company that won our competition back in 2015 was Mobile ODT, and they were entirely based on helping African populations. They had developed a mobile colposcope, and basically this was enabling physicians there to screen females and be able to take AI to evaluate these lesions, but also to consult. Telepresence, consulting with others who may be able to help them diagnose those things. And they've been a very successful company. So it's, there's opportunity when you're addressing these other populations. And then the last thing I'll say is, there's something to be said for companies that are able to develop their clinical trial designs that are more inclusive. You brought up the pulse ox. So we have a company now in our portfolio, Lori, who leads OptiSite, which is a monitor for cellular O2 and can predict organ failure. And she actually was able to, get a clinical trial through that just completed, where she tested 150 patients across different skin tones. And that kind of clinical trial design attracted VC investment, because there are people who are aligned with that mission as well.
Yeah, Kate and Catherine covered some of the topics that I had in mind, but honestly, as an engineering leader that leads teams of R&D folks and product managers, the key is workplace diversity also translates into product diversity. Technology companies, tech companies are known for bias in technology and some algorithmic bias because of starting to test on the workforce population first, which is the most accessible population to test on. So having designers that have empathy for the end user, either through that immersion, clinical immersion, free living immersion or in-use immersion is critical. It's also important to have perspective. So I have an example. We were working on a product for babies, and that team of designers didn't have any parents, and that essentially was a missing ingredient in creating the right product. And a new parent that entered into the team helped improve the product within a month. And I can quote multiple examples like this where having the right diversity in hiring and retention of diverse population, parents, women, people of color, is just as critical in health equity and products that have that design for all mindset. One other thing I wanted to add here is when we think about exclusion criteria for clinical trials, it's almost always like there was this, I don't know how many of you watched John Oliver. He had this parody thing going about diversity in medical devices. And I think there was this quote about how women are just men with pesky hormones. That's really the mindset that we've been applying in many of this. Like let's keep this engineering design and clinical trial design or early feasibility design simple. Let's not overcomplicate. Let's not have confounding factors like pregnancy or breastfeeding or color, or being having hormones, right? So that mindset is like physiology is the biggest confounder. To say that I have this perfect device that is not varying across parts, like I've made this perfect accurate thing, is not the point. The point is to have physiological accuracy, and that requires testing on the right diverse population, and I think it starts with hiring.
So at the risk of sounding cynical and a little trite, I think what I see is most of the incentives that drive innovation and choices around innovation are financial, right? Is there a business case for this indication? Are the revenue models going to support the cost of developing it? Are patients going to use it? Are clinicians going to adopt it? And who's going to pay for it? And rarely in that discussion, even though people may care about these issues on a personal level, on a philosophical level, does the question of health equity come up. What I do see as a lawyer and more of a trusted advisor is that when FDA issues a guidance, you'll have 15 advisories from law firms and consultants telling you how to interpret it. You'll have many, many calls from people on your reg team figuring out how they need to resource it and how this guidance is going to impact product development and quality and commercialization. And so I think the solution and what I would love to see this time next year is a guidance from FDA on how to build and design medical device with health equity in mind, and where health equity is correlated to safety, effectiveness, and quality. We've seen FDA do this with cybersecurity. We've seen them do it with interoperability. They've taken a total life cycle approach. We've had FDA say, I've had them say to my clients, don't come to a pre-sub meeting without addressing the cybersecurity impacts of this device, because it is now a subsystem of quality and it directly impacts safety. So what if, as a part of product development, there was a guidance that said, you have to address how this product or this indication will positively or negatively impact outcomes and the things you're trying to solve for diverse communities. How are you going to define that? Not all Black women are African American women, for example. So there's work to do in that. And if your product may have adverse impact on diverse communities in terms of outcomes or access, what are the controls and the processes in place that you can implement to mitigate that? And how do all those things tie into safety and efficacy? And if companies were forced to think about that as a part of a total life cycle approach, because it was tied to a product clearance or a commercial strategy, I think people would do it, and we would figure out how to do it, and it would be resourced. So, and I think with the people in this room, there's enough brain power, there's enough legislative will. If FDA needs a legislative authority to do it, although they do a lot of things, be a guidance. I think that's something that's worth looking at, and that is a concrete thing where the folks in this room can influence how regulators and companies think about it. That's what I'd like to say.
You said you were going to be a little cynical. I'm going to be very practical. I'm not known for, being politically correct, so I hope that's okay. In our experience, the only thing that has mattered in what we do, despite what I think is a moral obligation for us to have a responsible footprint, despite what I think is an opportunity for us to be better as an industry, the only thing that has mattered is what's the ROI. And when you have that conversation with someone and you need to say or ask something, but you kind of wait till the very end. You're like, it's the pleasantries and, this is cool, this is great, but I have to sell this to my manager. Or if you're management, I have to get buy-in from my other teams because this is a change. And the reality is, if we want difference in outcome, a change in outcome, we have to change how things are done. And I think by nature, we as people tend not to like change, right? And I remember, in terms of incentives, I will tell people point blank, if we were not cheaper than what we're replacing, we would not get anywhere. If EPA and lawyers were not regulating and suing, there would be no incentive, because in reality, we've been using a technology that has been linked to cancer for decades. And actually, it heralded the advent of all this novel technologies using innovative plastics, and it was a great thing for what it enabled. But now we're between rock and a hard place. And so I think of our customers. We did a site visit, and our champion internally is head of quality, which, as we've learned, it is very uncomfortable to ask someone in a quality function to be innovative. Because that is not their incentive. Their incentive is to make sure nothing bad happens, right? Just like if we're asking someone in an innovation function to make sure the products always get there on time at the right time, you are asking the wrong person. And so whenever we're working with whomever we're working with, over half of our customers are publicly traded strategics. US HQ, Europe HQ, Asia HQ. We always have to look at what does this person want? What are they going to get excited by? Never, ever, in all of our conversations, we've talked to hundreds of companies, has anyone come on the call and said, we love that we're reducing the use of a cancer-causing agent in the communities. We love that we'll reduce carbon emissions. And it's not because they don't care about that. It's just that they're not incentivized in their job to care about that. And that's not wrong. It's not bad. We just have to work with the incentives that exist. And for us, we're implementing something that changes manufacturing. It impacts product. It impacts sterilization, packaging, supply chain, regulatory, financial. And so the linking of incentives, now that's interesting. I didn't realize when we were starting this company, I'd be playing chess on 100 boards, right? But I think that's the exciting thing, right? I have this philosophy, either it happens or I die trying. And I think sometimes we underestimate the ability of one person, or in our case, a team that's profoundly committed to make an overarching impact, but that's also very focused on making sure that that person that you're getting on your team, from the strategic, from the customer, sees themselves in the story of what you're trying to accomplish, right? So I still remember we had a plant visit The R&D guy was super nervous because he's like, CL, like, I'm super excited. I see the business case, but our plant guys, they don't really like change. And so we brought our, we sterilized with packaging, so you don't need to use capital equipment. So we brought some stuff over. And I remember sitting in this room, in this old manufacturing plant, and people are coming into the room, and because it's also the break room, grabbing donuts as we're meeting. And, we did a demo, and something popped in the room, right? And they were like, oh my goodness. Someone who worked on the line, who was quiet, this young woman who was just quiet the whole meeting, was like, leaned over to someone, could have heard a pin drop. I think this would make our lives so much easier. And it's those moments that are the real victories, right? It's the moment, it's the walking forward, because we have this big, big goal, as we should, but I think we shouldn't get lost in the goal. It's, forward progress is really important, and getting advocates along the way, even if they might not care about someone who lives in Southern California, who lives a mile from these plants and is worried about their kid, getting cancer, they're still helping that person, right? And so that question at the very end of what's their ROI, what's the business case? Help me make the business case. That's what people are actually saying. And it takes creativity as well. Typically when we talk to supply chain, they're like, all right, well, what's your cost? How many units? What's the cost per unit? Boom. How can we negotiate lower so that, I meet my objectives with my boss? But they don't, I know you're going to cut me off. I'll finish up real quick. I could tell I could go on for hours, because this is really exciting, because this is like, how do you actually get an organization to change in a profound way, right? And it's, okay, I need you to go to your VP of finance or whoever in your finance team and ask them, what is the cost of days on hand? If we cut down the amount of time our inventory is in our supply chain somewhere, not with our customers, from 2 weeks to 1 day, what's the value of that, right? I think it's on us, as hard as it can be, to give people the tools to help us get the outcomes that'll impact everyone.
Yeah. No, thank you. All of those were just amazing. And I do have to be aware of this little ticking clock. I can just see over the edge of the stage here. And I have to know, is that our total time? And if so, I'm sure there's some questions for this panel. So should we move on to that? Good? All right. If I can have some help handing out the mics to some of the attendees in the room. And I don't know if you will see another panel of amazing rock stars like this in person. So please let us know. Do we have some questions? And we have incredibly bright spotlights in our eyes right now. So, right.
Kristen Cardinal from Cal Poly. I'm really interested in this notion of the FDA having guidance on this. And I was wondering if anyone would take a stab at just imagining if that were to come out, let's say next month FDA issues guidance, you have to address health equity. What do you think some of the first examples would be within a company to make changes towards that? Do you think it really does start at the beginning of the pipeline, or do you think there's quicker, more near-term changes that maybe aren't linked to ROI, but might be things that companies would do immediately if a guidance like that came out?
I have a point of view. Essentially, the FDA has started giving guidance for many of these things, especially with the pulse ox. I think it's pretty well documented now that they're requiring the right representation in the clinical trials, and that's true for clinical trials too. Honestly, I think we didn't get to this part, but technology plays a huge role, both to be the evil, but the enabler in health equity happening. Honestly, with the digital workflow that we have, the data, the longitudinal data, and the population data that we have, we'll be able to actually track representation much better. Without these sensors, wearables, and continuous data acquiring devices, we're not able to essentially figure out the differences between the diverse populations. So if the FDA were to come up with a means, I think the technology is already in the early phases where we're able to, AI models or ML models that we train on, we're able to clearly see if it's fair, if we have the right representation across men, women, black, white. So we can track that and be able to be audited and be able to present that data. So we can self-audit, audit with FDA and present that data. So that's probably the first step I can think of that if there were a ruling by FDA. And it's going to, and the other piece that we were discussing about in our pre-discussions was if the FDA has regulations, technology will find a way. Right? We make connectivity much more seamless now. Connectivity was horrible before. Things didn't work on multiple platforms. Now things are working better. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's working better on multiple platforms. So technology will follow. We need a stick and then some carrots for technology to build.
And I think one thing, jump in here, I think one thing that's important to remember is that we are not at FDA now saying it's nice to have diversity, it's nice to have diverse clinical trials. With the passage of the FDORA, the Food and Drug Omnibus Report Act, which was really just signed in December of 2022, we're now requiring sponsors of device clinical trials to come in with diversity action plans. So come in and let us know how what are your plans for enrollment, particularly of diverse and underrepresented populations, particularly if the indication is associated with health disparities and health disparity variables. So we have a lot of activity in this space right now, and we're working with a lot of different centers to try to not only work with the technology companies, and you were mentioning earlier the collaborative communities, with sponsors and clinicians, with patient groups themselves to sort of better understand a lot of these disparity variables, but also support programs that actually take these into account. So as another example, just recently we updated our draft guidelines for the Breakthrough Devices program. And in that update, there's pretty specifically laid out how certain technology companies, particularly if you're doing improvements in device performance or better diagnostics, more effective treatments, for example, that this may be a program that's applicable to you if those improved treatments and diagnostics are supporting communities that have been impacted by disparities that suffer from greater sort of disparity variables. So we've got a lot of work in this space. The idea of a guidance, I think that that is something that I'm sure we're open to. But I think it's certainly a wonderful idea for us to think through these together with you all. Yeah.
Pass the microphone, second row.
This is a great panel topic. Wanted to double click on Vanessa and CL's ROI and financial topic. And with that, would like to ask you, in terms of the $8 billion that goes into financing medical device startups, seed all the way through late stage. There are a lot of women investors in the room, from corporate investors to individual angel investors to early and late stage investors. Would love to get your thoughts on the investor mindset on this really important topic, the fact that there are still limited female angels, female LPs, female corporate C-suite investors in our med tech companies, and what we can do about that. And then also from a board, KOL, advisory board role we can play as members of this community.
Now, quick question. So if you're talking about overall ROI, we have a whole panel coming up. Yeah. So that's awesome, but I also heard
hold
something.
that then.
What's that?
If that's on the next panel.
Next panel. Like, okay. That was
But I do know that Vanessa and CL have spent a lot of time thinking about this.
I do have just a quick plug in response to your question.
Yeah.
I would encourage everybody, if you're not aware of it, to check out the American Medical Association In Full Health initiative. That initiative is specifically focused on addressing all of the things that Jenny just raised, and they have a full slate of items, but one of the items is every part of the assessment of every investment or innovative technology should be the impact on health equity and changing the dialogue so that health equity is a fundamental metric that should be assessed when evaluating an investment or a technology. And they're developing a series of playbooks and things that they want to roll out to the investment community to empower them, right, to start to build that into the ROI analysis. So definitely worth checking it out, and MedTech Color and many others in the room are working in that initiative with the AMA.
I like to just, one thing about investment, right? So we're venture-backed, and in our first round, I tried very hard and made it my mission, and we were able to accomplish over half of our investors are female investors or from underrepresented backgrounds. And what I realized and what I learned through that process is women and men do not invest the same way. If I have a guy that invests in my round, I know afterwards he will call up his buddies, or I will get 3 or 4 or 5 emails from his guy friends who are like, hey, I want in. I don't care. This guy is in. I don't want to be the chump in my friend group that's not in. Swear to God, right? And for every dollar from a female angel, I've had to put in 5 times the amount of work. And so there's really an opportunity to put our money where our mouth is. And the deal with venture is there is risk, right? There is risk. It could go to 0, but it could also go high multiples. But what I also realize is we have to ask as founders. Guys will always come up to me and say, hey, I want in, right? When's your next round? I've never had a female investor come up and say, you know, I want to be a part of this. I've had to, you know, we purposely seek out diverse, you know, funds run by diverse folks because we get, you know, this is part of the impact we get to make. I've always had to say, listen, there's nothing more inspiring to me than the possibility of making a lot of money. That and making an impact in the communities and in MedTech gets me up in the morning. I want you to be part of it. And so I think just as we have to invite participation from, you know, patients and from others, as founders, we also have to invite participation. And if we want to see different companies, they need to get funded, right? We need to write checks. So, thank you.
So I saw there's one more question over here, and then all the panelists, I think I had given you an assignment to come up with like one takeaway, one resource you can mention. I know we're recording this, so people won't be scribbling notes like crazy. But you have a microphone?
Yes.
Go for it.
I want to say fantastic panel. You know, it's very enlightening to hear the conversation. I guess my question is for Lida as well as you, Vanessa, in terms of the work FDA is doing. Do you think they're putting enough effort into thinking how many, what, and what representation looks like in clinical trials? Because one of the problems we have is you have 10, 15, 20%, and the data is lost in that size. So any comments on the work that's happening behind the scenes with FDA?
Lida, you should take that one first.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like I mentioned, I think, at least in terms of some of the legislation that's been passed, we, you know, that the Consolidated Appropriations Act literally asks for multiple health equity initiatives across public, to include public equity across the total product life cycle. So we are really committed now, and literally it's part of our charter to think through how do these devices get across to representative patient populations for their intended use. So that's sort of one piece of it, the actual sort of sponsorship and device side of it. I think in terms of the clinical trial side of it, and actually was going to be one of the resources that I suggest, I think looking into some of the new guidances that we have developed in terms of clinical diversity and emerging clinical trials should hopefully be pretty informative. There we do, again, try to specifically lay out things for enrollment plans in trials. And then a last resource I might also add is we also published an AI/ML action plan. I think in that action plan, we certainly address the need for addressing disparities in AI models, which, as many of you probably already know, there is certainly a risk there to exacerbate a lot of the disparities. So we have a lot of work in this space. I think we don't specifically, to the point that was made earlier, have a guidance for equity, but I don't think it is a far-off concept for our work, to be honest.
So I know that usually before guidance goes out, before any potential thing goes out, a lot of times you request submissions and input from the community.
Absolutely.
Do you know, is there an open request for input from community, or is that what's the best way that we could supply input at this point?
I think right now there isn't a request in sort of the practical sort of government sense of the word, where we go through a lot of processes and then we put it out into the federal registrar. We don't have that out yet, but certainly with the Digital Health Center of Excellence, we have an easily available email. You can email some of these questions and we can direct you, depending a lot on where your product might fit, whether it's particularly within our center, the devices, or perhaps the Center for Drugs or Biologics. I think we can certainly guide you to the right place.
I would just add to that, there's also a mailbox. It's a general product agnostic pathway that anybody can write a guidance. You can write your own draft guidance and submit it to FDA. They will look at it. And if you write it well, it might actually become the roadmap for something that you want to see. And so I think FDA is doing a lot of amazing things on clinical trials, on data, on listening to patient voices, but I do think the time is optimal for a product-agnostic guidance on health equity, and I think the people in this room, should be leading the discussion on what that looks like.
Excellent. Okay, any last takeaways for?
I have a bunch, but I'll try to keep it short. I know part of the assignment was, where to go to read more. And so I feel like you don't have to leave this room to learn more. Vanessa, MedTech Color, Diversity by Doing, the joint effort by Stanford Biodesign and Fogarty. So a lot of people are working to address this. And I guess the thing that I thought was really great this morning that Mia said was ultimately, representation matters. At every step of the way, from innovation all the way down through supply chain. And there are, on the next panel, we're going to talk about the business case. But I also wanted to say, there are many ways that we can do this where an investment is worth it. Number one, hiring, as you mentioned, having, those agendas internally. Second, Vanessa and I talked about network. We didn't get to talk about spotlight versus pipeline, but going to the places where people are. So we were having what I would call a pipeline issue at MedTech Innovator of seeing diverse founders. And we went to MedTech Color and found that there's no pipeline problem. It's a spotlight problem. We need to go where they are and find them. And then the last thing I'll say is, we didn't talk about marketing. When you're getting to that end and you're marketing your products, representing all types of people, that doesn't add any cost, right? But it makes a big difference because, seeing is believing.
We're going to need a bigger couch next year. We need a marketing person and a couple other, definitely maybe a clinical trials expert. I think we're going to fill the entire stage here.
That sounds terrific.
Nivi?
So I have a lot of takeaways, but in terms of logistical resources, there are a lot of teams that are working on health equity. The Health Equity and Access Leadership Consortium, that's one HEAL. And I'm really a fan of this Digital Medicine Society, DIME, and DIME's a member of HEAL. So if you're looking for just basic resources to get started on how do I do inclusion by design and start from scratch. So I think DIME has some really good resources to start off. And then Google also has this responsible AI. I think now they're planning to run a Google Health Equity Summit every year. There's one recording on YouTube right now. I love it. It's a 4-hour recording. I'd encourage you to if you're getting immersed, just start with that. And FDA also has a podcast I saw that I've been subscribing to, and it's been very helpful in just orienting us. So it's the podcast it's called the Health Equity Forum.
Mine is short. Everybody in this room could join MedTech Color or challenge your organization to get involved and get active. There are so many opportunities within that organization, within all of the organizations represented, to start to really deepen the conversation and start to solve these problems in a meaningful way. And this is a part of it, just having the opportunity to be on the stage. So thank you. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, MedTech Women.
Any last assignments? Places to go check out?
Assignments. I love assignments. There's so many inspiring things about this conference so far. Yeah? Yeah. And we all have a bit of what it is to, reach health equity that really calls to us. And so the homework or the challenge, whatever you want, right, is whatever that is to articulate for yourself and to get to work on moving the ball forward, right? Because that doesn't happen unless we all move the ball forward. It might seem daunting as one individual, but, the people who doubt you, 3 years later, be like, I knew that you were going to do this all along. So our day zero can be today.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much.
Nice job, yeah.